Thanks, Julie. Hi, everyone. You know what? Let me just change this to gallery view so I can see as many of you as I can see. Hello, good morning, or good time of day, wherever you are. When you came in, you may have heard us singing Misha Nichnas Adar Marbim Besimcha. How wonderful that we have 2 months of Adar this year and 2 months to enjoy and to consciously enjoy the increase of Simcha. So for those of you unfamiliar with that concept, from the Talmud, it says, Misha nechnas Adar marbim besimcha. As soon as the month of Adar comes in, joy increases in the world. And this is in opposition to the month of Av, which we say, Misha nechnas Av mat'im besimcha. When Av comes in, the world decreases in Simcha because we have the holiday of Tisha B'Av. And things naturally start to get sadder for us. But we're experiencing the opposite because we're in Adar and things are great. We have 2 months of Adar. So our kavanah for Adar, I just want to wish you the greater sensation of being able to sense the simcha, a sensation of simcha with your nose, with your eyes, with your touch, however you receive this increase of simcha, or that you have the ability to cultivate more simcha in your life for these 2 months. Well, I guess 1 more month because we're already halfway through Adar Aleph. And I can say personally, my body is responding with simcha to the fact that it's been 60 degrees for the last 2 days. And I know we're in the midst, this is a climate crisis, and I know it's affecting people in real and devastating ways. And this February warmth is really thawing my body, and I'm feeling the simcha like the trees and the plants, symbolizing the hopefulness and the hopeful nearness of spring. So let's jump into this week's Parsha, which is Parashat Ki Tisa. And Julie will drop a link for the source sheet on Sefaria, but I will also share screen. So, you don't have to go there. But if you feel like printing it out or you want to, follow along or keep it for later, feel free. You'll have access to it. So we'll bless our learning this morning or this time of day, wherever it is that you are. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, master of the cosmos, who makes us holy through these commandments, and specifically makes us holy through this commandment to la'asok b'divrei Torah, to immerse ourselves in Torah study. May the words of Torah that we learn today, may they release their inner secrets for us, their deeper meanings. May we come to love them and embed them in our souls as we take this learning into ourselves and we share it with our children, with our teachers, with our neighbors, with anyone who looks to us for wisdom and guidance. May we offer them some words of Torah. And may we all continue to merit the incredible honor, pleasure, and joy of being able to study Torah Lishma, Torah for its own sake in the middle of the day. What an amazing, amazing privilege. Baruch atah Adonai, hamelamed Torah le'amo Yisrael. Blessed are you, God, who teaches Torah to those who seek you, your people Israel. Okay, so let me share my screen. Let's see, am I on the right place? I am. Share screen with Chrome. All right, you all can see what I'm seeing? Awesome, super. So let's just jump in. First, I'm going to move all of your beautiful faces to this side of the screen. And here we go. Right at the beginning of the parasha, Shemot 30, 11, 12, because verse 11 is just Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. God spoke to Moses saying, Ki Tisa et rosh b'nei Yisrael. When you take a census of the Israelite men, according to their army enrollment, each shall pay to Adonai a ransom for himself on being enrolled, that no plague may come upon them through their being enrolled. And that ransom, that price, the admission fee is a half shekel, which we'll come back to a little bit later. So Ki Tisa then continues with more instructions on building the Mishkan and more about keeping the mitzvah of Shabbat, including Veshamru, which we sing on Friday nights. And maybe next year, I would love, there's so much in this Torah portion. I mean, there's so much in all of them. But maybe next year we can talk about what it means that those who desecrate Shabbat will surely die. Like, what does that mean for us? And then following the mitzvah of Shabbat, we get into the story of the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf, for which, this parasha is known. And that's what we're going to explore today, like what that really means, especially we're still in COVID times, but, as it relates to COVID times. And then the parasha concludes with the reciting of the 13 attributes, which we recall on the high holy days. Adonai. All right. So that is the parasha in a small snippet. So let's get into our Egel HaZahav, our golden calf. So fast forward a little bit to Exodus chapter 32, and it says, when the people saw that Moshe was so long in coming down from the mountain, the people gathered against Aharon and said to him, come, make us a god who shall go before us. For that fellow Moshe, the man who brought us from the land of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. And Aharon said to them, and I like to think that he said like a whole bunch of other stuff, and there was a whole back and forth here, because I can't believe that he was convinced this easily, but we'll see. We'll see what the Midrash has to say about that. Aharon said, take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. And all the people took off the gold rings that were in their ears and brought them to Aharon. This he took from them and cast into a mold and made it into a molten calf of gold. And they exclaimed, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And they went and they proceeded to have a big party around the golden calf. So, wow, this is like our cardinal sin, right? Like, we don't talk so much about what happened in Gan Eden with Adam and Chava. When we talk about something like a stain on our ancestral history, it's the Egel HaZahav. And I feel for the Israelites. I really understand this situation. So here's how I understand it. Tell me if you have experience with this as well. God and the Israelites were in a rather new relationship, right? Even though Hashem had performed many miracles for them in Mitzrayim, which we'll soon celebrate, and had just appeared to them on Har Sinai, right, on Mount Sinai. That was like 2 or 3 parshiot ago. It wasn't that long ago. It doesn't appear that Moshe or Aharon communicated with the Israelites about the source of the plagues, right? So they didn't even, and actually for the majority of those plagues, they were shielded in Goshen safely, right? So they didn't even experience most of them. We are, reading this story, we have more knowledge than the Israelites in the situation about what's going on around them. And they only learned about the source of the plagues and their source of protection when the last plague was passing over them. Again, they're not really experiencing it. They're just like hearing about it and seeing what's happening to other people. Then, fast forward, they're on their own at the banks of the Red Sea. They saw Moses. They saw Moshe raise his hand and split the sea, and again to close it over the Egyptians, right? So like all they're experiencing is Moshe. as the arbiter of God's miracles. And so then, Exodus later on 1431, like right before the before the sea splits, they say they believed in God and they believed in Moses, God's servant. And so for them, Moses was the physical representation of God. And they couldn't see God, but they could see Moses. So when Moses went away for 40 days and 40 nights, which, may not seem like a long time to us, but thinking about all of the trauma that they just went on and thinking about that, they're like kids, right? They're just being brought into this situation. Moses is all they know. They don't know where they're going. It's like 40 days and 40 nights is an eternity. And it was unclear to them if God was still there, since they had never had any time without Moses before, right? They had never had direct contact with God alone either. So it's not like they had an avenue to say, well, Moses is gone, but let me check in with God. Let me make sure God's still, like there was no personal prayer. There wasn't a Mishkan yet. There was no one to lead or innovate any of these things yet. Yeah, I just can really feel how scared and alone the Israelites must have felt at that time, how vulnerable and confused. So from this place of vulnerability, confusion, aloneness, they went to Aharon and they were desperate for protection from some divine source, saying, because we don't know what became of this man, Moshe, this human being, like humans get killed all the time. We don't know what happened to that guy. We need something that can ensure our protection because we're out here unguided and all alone. Okay. They were looking for some physical connection. So I compare this in my mind to a long distance relationship, right? And that's essentially what they were dealing with between God and the Israelites. And it's similar, like what they're going through is similar to what modern day long distance relationships suffer. Even close relationships, but I'm thinking specifically because of the distance between them in the worlds. When we talk about long distance relationships, people often say these two adages. The first, absence makes the heart grow fonder. And the second, out of sight, out of mind, right? And that's pretty much what we're dealing with the Israelites and God, right? We don't know what became of this man, Moses, right? He's not here. And he wasn't, it's as if him and his message and the relationship that he was building and that he was brokering, because, that's what he was, brokering between God and the Israelites. It's like it didn't even exist anymore. Further on in the relationship, the participants can be secure and can take comfort in that former adage, right? At a later stage, they can mutually work on building a container for Kedusha, a container for the holiness that connects them to one another and allows for the absence to, in fact, grow the intimacy between them, that for the distance to grow the intimacy between them, making the heart grow fonder. And in fact, we'll see this later on in the building of the Mishkan, right, of the project, that it helps to nurture the connection in the relationship. But when the relationship is new, like it is now, there's so much insecurity that it helps to have a tangible representation of the relationship, which the Israelites did not have and sought to create with Egel HaZahav, the golden calf. So I'm going to turn down to text number 3 right here for one of my colleagues, Rabbi Jessica Minin, who reminds us that Ki Tisa confronts us with the infamous story of the golden calf. And if pressed to choose 2 words to describe this narrative, I go with intimacy fail, as we've just said. According to the first verse, when the people saw that he was delayed in coming down from the mountain, they gathered against Aaron and said, rise up and make for us a God who will go before us. Because this man, this Moses, who brought us from the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him. And he, Aharon, took the gold rings from their hands and formed them into a casting mold, making them into the molten calf, and said, these are your gods. Well, they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. And so when Moses comes down from Sinai, he finds the people in the throes of idol worship and smashes the tablets of the 10 commandments, the first set of tablets, which we'll get into. Oy, oy, oy for the people. And so she continues, she writes, what I find most compelling here are the relationships, the intimacy or lack thereof between the people and Moses, the people and God. Instead of dialogue, transparency, vulnerability, and reciprocity, we find silence, obfuscation, insulation, and isolation. Wow. And we, thinking about the story, we as readers, we're reading on what's going on, and Moses is up the mountain, and he's getting all of this and that, and the back and forth with God, and all the instructions. And meanwhile, this story is basically a big meanwhile at the bottom of the mountain, right? There's all the silence. They don't know what's going on. None of this is coming down to them. And they're told, you have to stand a distance. Don't touch the mountain. Don't come near the mountain, right? And so what's going on? Moses becomes other. God becomes other. God's already other, but because Moses has now become other, then God also becomes other. And the result is fear, anger, and violence. We didn't talk yet about the violence that comes from all of this. The story continues in a grisly, less-sighted fashion. Arm yourselves with swords and go back and forth from gate to gate throughout the camp. Kill every man and his brother, every man and his companion, every man and his neighbor. Whew. The Levites did this according to the word of Moses, and 3,000 men fell that day. That's a little bit further on. Like, wow. And so as, thinking about this as a person who has been in relationship, and I've been in long distance relationships, I really feel for the Israelites and their need to make this connection, especially coming from, they've been in Mitzrayim for 400 years, right? So they're very disconnected from the faith practices of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, right? From the traditional Israelite practices. So they were deep, deep, deep in Egyptian culture, deep in idol culture. So that's all they knew. So they're like, well, that's what we know. Let's just do what we know. So was this really necessary? It's a good question. Rabbi Minan asks, what would have happened had one person intervened? Moses will come back. God is still with us. It's like Joshua and Caleb, like they're those people, but they were, doing something else at the time. Where was someone else to jump in and remind people of the faith, to speak up about the miracles? What would have happened had one person come out and said, no, this is not who we are. And this is not what we want. What would have happened? I see a question. Julie, are we taking questions now? Are we doing questions at the end?
Totally up to you.
Okay, Arlene. You're muted.
I think it's very easy to understand the Israelites' position, the way you explained it, the way we read it in the Torah. My question is, and you just mentioned, what would have happened if one person intervened? How do we justify Aaron's reaction? And as a leader, as Kohanim, how do we justify that? I mean, for me personally, it's much easier to understand the reaction of the Israelites as a group than Aaron as one individual leader.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to hold that and come back to that after we go through this next piece. I'm going to jot it down for myself, because I think it's relevant to this next part that we're gonna talk about. Let's see, who's this? Esther? Where did Esther go?
Okay. I have two comments. The first one was about, you talked about God told them to be counted. And Rabbi Goldberg, I remember from Boca, said that we Jews don't count people. We count contribution. Like in numbers, we are so much smaller than, let's say, China or India, but look at the contributions that the Jewish people brought. And my second comment was, you talked about Shabbat, and Shabbat is actually mentioned twice, once before and now. The first time it says Zachor, and then it says Shamor. So to me, one means the connection between us and God, so that we should remember. And like we have Shabbat, we are all together. And the Shamor is what we cannot do. So it's the positive and the negative in the two mentioning of Shabbat.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Betsy, and then Stephen, and then we'll jump into the next text.
Hi, I'm thinking about the marshmallow study, where little kids are told, if we leave, you can have one marshmallow, but if you can be quiet for like 3 minutes, you'll come back and get 2 marshmallows. Now we have no idea what the instructions were to, hey, you stay here and chill, and I'll be back with something special. We have no idea, but even with those instructions, I think very few kids, like 25%, actually waited for that second marshmallow. I mean, this is really human nature. So that's my contribution.
That's great. And I think it really helps for when we think about the Israelites as children, not in a paternalistic way, but they're a nation just being born. They have not had any freedom before, and they really need guidance, support, and help, and are now being left on their own. Yeah, Stephen.
Yes, going back to Aaron. Why didn't Aaron consult the Urim and Thurim?
Oh, didn't exist yet.
I thought it came in last week.
No, we got Moses. See, remember, this is like Moses is getting downloading all of this information. And this week's Torah portion is, meanwhile, at the bottom of the mountain, right? So like everything that we've had up until now is like Moses. Now we're scene cutting over to what's going on in Moses's absence. So all of this back knowledge that we know, they don't have any of that yet.
So the problem is timing. If he would have given Aaron the Urim and Thurim way before he went up, we might not have this.
Sure, but no one knew about that yet. Like he would have had to go up the mountain to get that at some point. And so it is a good question of timing. If he went in chunks and say he went like 40 days and 40 nights, say he went for like a week at a time, and came back every Shabbos to teach them about Shabbos, like that would have been cool. But that's not what happened. So it's really interesting to wonder, like, how could we have avoided this whole situation? I don't know. I mean, I have my thoughts, but it's neither here nor there. All right, thank you all so much. Let's jump in let's go back to the text. And this is related to all of the comments that we have been saying about parenting anyways, and understand, like I was thinking about the marshmallow test as parenting, but teaching, interacting with young children. So Exodus 32, a little bit forward, when Joshua heard the sound of the people in its boisterousness, he said to Moses, now remember, Joshua's like sort of standing guard on the mountain. And I think Joshua and Caleb, we've discovered in the Torah, those are the upstanders. Those are the people that we expect to shout out like, hey, God's okay, like Moses is okay, etc. But again, this is still early in their relationship. So we don't, we know these things further on in like Bamidbar, but this is like really right at the beginning of Moses's journey as well. So when Joshua heard the sound of the people and its boisterousness, he said to Moses, "There is a cry of war in the camp." But then he answered, he continued, "Well, it's not the sound of the tune of triumph, or is it the sound of the tune of defeat? It's the sound of song I hear." Like that's bizarre. And so, Moses, who had come running like, "Oi, my children are in trouble, my babies, they need me," comes down, and as soon as he gets near the camp, he saw the golden calf and the dancing, and he became enraged, right? Like he's just been up the mountain thinking about the Mishkan and learning about the Mishkan and dreaming like, oh my God, this is going to be so beautiful. We're going to create this connection for Hashem and the Jewish people and whatever. And like just had Sinai, and they were at Sinai, and God literally just said, like, don't make any graven images, don't worship anything else besides me. And Moses thinking, sure, they'll hold that, right? And I have this experience all the time as like a teacher. It's like, I've said this thing and I expect that my students are going to remember it because it's important to me. It wasn't so important to the Israelites, or maybe it was important and they just, had greater needs in the time. So Moses became enraged and he hurled the tablets from his hands and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. And this is crazy. He took the calf that they had made and burned it and ground it to powder and strewed it upon the water, and so made the Israelites drink it, which I think is also really fascinating. And we only have until 11:15, right, Julie? Yeah. So there's all kinds of connections that I really want to make between like the sota ritual and like, what do you do when someone is, what does the Torah say that we do when we feel like there's been infidelity, right? Like there's this whole, now I guess I'm going into it just a little bit. There's this whole ritual of when there's infidelity, the husband brings the wife before, because it only goes one way. The husband brings the wife before the council is like, I think there's been infidelity. And so they like do this magic over the stuff and they make them drink it. The woman drinks it. And like, if her stomach like explodes, then it's like, aha, she was unfaithful, but otherwise it's not. And this feels like the same thing. It's like you all were cheating on God. Like this is terrible. Because Moses is not reading this with the same eyes that we're understanding it. Like we understand, I think, who just said that? It was Arlene was saying like, it's so easy to connect with the Israelites and to understand where they're coming from. Like there is no transparency, as Rabbi Minin pointed out, right? Like we don't know what the marching orders were. We don't know what they were left with. So of course they're responding in this way. But Moses, because he's getting all of that, right? He's like, how are you not doing this? Like, how are you not following these rules that I'm giving? Because that's his perspective. So then we get to this text of God and Moses. Did I put it on the source sheet? Oh, I didn't put this text on the source sheet. Oh, darn it. Oh, well. At this point, like Moses goes and like, talks to God again. And so I like to imagine God and Moses in this way. Let me see if I can stop sharing for a moment while we're talking so we can see each other. I imagine God and Moses as parents, co-parents of the Israelites, right? And so there's this like other parent, and this you may have had this kind of experience, right? God says to Moses, hurry down, for your people have acted up, right? This is what Moses said. God's saying to Moses, your people have acted up. And Moses responds a few verses later, you need to consider that this is your people too. And it's like, when the kids do something wrong, honey, look what your son did. So my son, when he does something wrong, it's my kid. But, and it's like this case of like back and forth. And I think, Moses won this, right? Like Moses comes and is like, these are your people. Like you signed me up for this job, right? Like I didn't ask for any of this. And so God doesn't destroy the people. But God was angry. So angry for the same reasons that Moses was angry. And again, I feel sorry, God, like it's not justified, right? It's not a human experience. And also, I mean, how can we expect that God has this knowledge of what it means to be a human, right? God is so other, right? Like to not understand what it means to be newly born, to be scared, to be vulnerable. These are not feelings that we imagine that the God character, I should say right here, the character of God in the Torah has familiarity with. And there's a fantastic book that I absolutely love called The Personhood of God by Yehezkel someone. It's a green book. It's fantastic. And it talks about the character of God in the Torah and how it develops over time. So in thinking about like the character of God in the relationship, it's like, this is so new. How could you expect that like these people want to be in a relationship? They don't even know what's going on behind the scenes. So thinking about God as a parent, God had to calm God's self down. And, oh, thanks, Julie. And like, you know, just like parents have to do sometimes, I have certainly had, I've never put my own kid in timeout, but I've had to go take a timeout, right? And like, just go breathe and count and remember the blessings and how grateful we are to be parents and all that stuff to like, you know, be able to come back into the moment. And I feel like God is doing the same thing at the end of our Torah portion, right? Like God is coming back to like remind God's self, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun, right? Because it's unclear of who's doing the talking. It just isn't, and he said, and like the Torah uses he for God. So, you know, it could be Moses reciting these 13 attributes, but I like to think about it as God reminding God's self that God is El Rachum V'Chanun Erech Apayim V'Rav Chesed V'Emet, all of these good, positive attributes. Notzer Chesed La'alafim, right? Like giving what's the word? Chesed, loving kindness to the generations and taking away sin and being patient and all of this stuff. It's like, well, now's the time to be all these things because that's what it means to be a parent. Right. And that's what it means to lead a nation. That's what it means to God a people. Right. Because when God says, I'm taking you out of Mitzrayim in order to lihyot lehem le'elohim. I'm taking you out to be your God. Well, part of being a God, like I guess all of being a God, is having all of these attributes, this patience, this understanding, this forgiveness, because people are people. We are infallible. We are not gods. So during the high holidays, when we repeat these attributes in our liturgy, right, we're asking God to be as forgiving in that moment as God was at the moment of the golden calf. And God, you know, when we're repeating the attributes for the high holiday liturgy, we don't finish the verse, right? The verse finishes, Poker avon avot al banim va'al banim banim al shleshim va'al revi'im, right? Like I will remember the transgressions of the ancestors and I'll visit them generations and generations forward. So it's like, which is a whole other conversation, but you know, it's like God is saying, I forgive, but I don't forget. And so in this way, coming back to the golden calf, the Egel Zahav, it's our version of original sin, right? Rather than what happened in Gan Eden with Adam and Chava, right? This is what sticks with us. And this is what we continually come back to as a people to say, see this may not have been a good thing. And let's talk about why. Let's share my screen again as we go into a text from my friend, Adam Scher, who is currently the Director of Development at the Jewish Studio Project, formerly the Director of Transformative Experiences at Chazon. He said, technology is a tool, not an end in itself. If it's an end, it's an idol. Tools are processes, not objects. Committing the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which is a term of Alfred North Whitehead, is assigning existential value as an object to a fluid process or tool. This is idolatry. And more simply put, do you use technology or does it use you? And so in thinking about the chet of the Egel, it's like, this is your God, right? Like that's what the Israelites and whoever it was at that point, because it doesn't attribute that to Aharon, right? Like this is your God. And so this text is reminding us, just like we learned in the last text, that godding is a verb, right? God even says, "Lihyot lahem la'Elohim," right? To be for you a God, right? To God you, right? If the goal was to have the Egel Zahav as like to be that verb, then that's one thing, right? Like this is what's going to carry us. This is that process. But it seemed in itself the end, right? And the celebration happened just at its creation, right? With crossing the sea, something had actually happened. God had acted for the people, right? That warranted celebration. And then to have the same kind of celebration at the creation of this physical thing that hasn't done anything, hasn't earned any of that might also be why God was very upset. It's like that didn't even do anything against the same level of celebration. Do you know what I had to do to like deal with the plagues and all split the sea and all of these things? So I'm going to stop. No, I want to put these questions out here. As I think about what is the chet for us? Like what's in here? So in your own life, how do you define an idol, right? Like how does that play into this situation? Does our current fascination with certain aspects of technology fall under your definition? And how does this relate to addiction, right? And like also pulling in all of the feelings of the Israelites and understanding all of that, but now looking at it from our 21st century perspective and bringing it home for us. Has our notion of intimacy changed in our internet social media age? And how has that changed? I can certainly say for me it has. Then there's this idea of FOMO, the fear of missing out, which keeps a lot of people up late at night scrolling, right, when they should be going to sleep and getting good sleep. Does FOMO affect your ability to be present with those around you? Right, my husband will tell you, if only we could get the phones out of the bedroom. And does your desire to remain connected to people who don't live close to you affect your inability to disconnect or remain present with those around you? Especially we're thinking about Shabbat, which is, I'll come back to this, Shabbat, when we try to focus on people, and some people, the people in our immediate circles, and people will refrain from using technology on Shabbat. But I'm just going to skip really quickly to the sixth question. How has the COVID pandemic changed or affected your answers to any of these questions? And I know lots of people who have different thoughts about what it means to be close, and absence making the heart grow fonder, and intimacy in the age of COVID, because it created for many of us these same long distance relationships, the same wondering, is the relationship still there that the Israelites were experiencing in their way? And finally, does your desire to concretely preserve memories, right, in like an Egel kind of way, like that is a concrete preservation of something, prevent you from being fully in the experience as it is happening? And how might this relate to the prohibition against graven images? So I see we have 3 minutes and a couple of hands. These are all at the bottom of the source sheet, so you can, chew on these questions over Shabbat. And I want to hear from Susan and Doug, and then I'm going to offer a quick conclusion.
You ask way too many questions here, and it's just impossible to go through all those. And I personally wanted to go back to something you mentioned earlier, which was the question of what would happen if one person had stood up and said, and it reminds me so much of the story of Nachshon at the sea, and of Caleb and Joshua surveying the land. And in those cases, it was an individual or two who made all the difference in the world. And, God could not do those things by God's self. God needed the help of an individual to get through. And in this case, Moses wasn't there to guide the people, and Aaron just did the best he could, but he didn't lead in the heroic way that the others had led. Yeah. And you brought up the question, and I wanted you to answer it, and you didn't.
Yeah. Thank God we have Shabbos and so much Torah study, because it's a great question. Like, why Why wasn't Aharon able to do that? And yeah, you know what? I didn't look into that deeply because that is not a question that really stuck with my heart. But I hear that is, sticking to your hearts. So I encourage you to sit with those questions and to seek out those answers, because I know the Midrash has a lot to say about it, and especially our modern commentators. But one thing that I will say in thinking about it, it's all new, right? All of this, we have all of this back knowledge of, we see Aharon and Moses as like, the heroes of our tradition, and that they have all this power and the status, etc. It's all new for them. Less so for Aharon, because he was with the Israelites in Mitzrayim. But it was just him. Even with Korach, he had Moses with him, right? So Aharon against a mob. I also feel for that, right? Like, can one person, even though that one person is Aharon, really turn the tide of this mob, without Moses? So I'm not sure. I do wonder. I'm so glad you raised this question. So I want to leave you with a kavanah for the end of for taking into Shabbat. As we said, it says, Ki Tisa, when you are, and I think Esther pointed this out, like when you are doing your census, you count from each Israelite a half shekel, right? And I learned this week that a half shekel equals, or a whole shekel equals 20 gerah. And so if we have to give half, the Torah could have just said, give 10 gerah, right? Like that's a half shekel. And also a half shekel itself has a name, it's called a beka. So the text could have just said, give 1 beka. Why the need to emphasize the half shekel? And the Ben Ish Chai, who is Rav Yosef Chaim of Baghdad, points out that the plain meaning of the verse refers to the method of counting, right? Ki Tisa et Rosh means when you count. However, Ki Tisa b'nei Yisrael can mean when you elevate b'nei Yisrael, when you lift them up, Tisa from the root of Nasa. So saying half shekel comes to remind us of a spiritual leveling up, spiritual elevation. And it reminds us specifically with regard to being a member of the community, that without spiritual community which helps us cultivate a living connection to the God, however we understand God, we understand that we are half when we are disconnected, that we are not complete. So I encourage you this Shabbat to reach out for connection to Jewish community that you find connection to, that you find meaningful, and find ways to be in conscious contact with God, however you understand this notion of God, as we seek shalom, we seek shleimut, we seek wholeness. So I want to wish you all a Shabbat shalom and a Shabbat of wholeness for us all.